Some ropes are not meant for justice. They are meant for cruelty, for slow death, and for the silence of those too afraid to resist. On a blistering July afternoon in 186 under the burning sky of Prescott Valley, two young women hung suspended from wooden beams, their bodies swaying in the scorching desert wind. They were not hanged to die quickly. They were tied to suffer, to wither under the sun until breath itself abandoned them. The land around them was empty. Yet the silence screamed of violence. Emily, no more than 24, her brown hair tangled, lips cracked from thirst, arms bound so tight that her wrists bled into the dust. Beside her, Sarah, barely 21, her golden hair clinging to her face, her chest rising in weak, ragged gasps, their feet scraped against the dry air, never touching the ground. Every second was torment, not just of the body, but of the spirit. A message carved by cruel hands for anyone daring to look. At their feet, thrust into the ground, stood a charred wooden sign. The letters burned deep with a knife. This land belongs to Carver. Strangers will perish. The desert sun glared upon those words, branding them not just into the wood, but into the memory of anyone who passed by. In the West, justice was once a promise. But by the summer of 1876, it had rotted into a weapon wielded by men like Nathaniel Carver, a judge by title, a tyrant by nature. To him the land was not soil to be tended, but a trophy to be owned, and lives, whether of men or women, were tools broken, discarded, forgotten. The two women had names, but in Carver's eyes they were nothing but warnings. Their suffering turned into a banner of control. No jury, no trial, no mercy. Only the slow march of death in the open sun and the knowledge that the town would do nothing because fear had long since replaced courage. It is in moments like this that the West reveals its darkest truth. Not the gold, not the freedom, not the endless horizon, but the silence of neighbors who turned their eyes away. The surrender of good people to the will of one man. As the heat shimmered over Prescott Valley, and the cries of the bound women grew weaker, the land itself seemed to ache. Somewhere beyond the ridge, hoof-beats approached. One man was coming, unaware that his inheritance was not a home, but a battlefield already stained with despair. If you were the one to find them, bound and fading under the sun, would you dare to cut the rope? Thomas Grady had seen enough death in his 52 years to know when the end was near. But as he pulled his horse to a halt before the old cabin, the sight of those two women hanging there stirred something deep in his chest. They were not strangers anymore. They were the reason he could not turn away. He swung down, boots crunching in the dust, and cut the first rope with the edge of his hunting knife. Emily fell into his arms, her body limp and burning hot from the sun, her breath shallow, but still there. He laid her gently in the shade, then turned to Sarah. She was lighter, almost weightless, as if the desert had already stolen half her soul. He carried her inside, one step at a time, like a father carrying children too tired to walk. Inside, the cabin was dark and stale, the air heavy with years of neglect. Thomas cleared a space on the floor, spread his bedroll, and placed the women down. He fetched water from his canteen, tipping it carefully to their lips. At first, nothing. Then Emily swallowed, her eyes fluttering open, dazed but alive. Sarah followed soon after, her weak fingers clutching the edge of his shirt as if to anchor herself back to the world. For a long moment, Thomas just sat there by the fire he had managed to spark, watching the flames dance across their faces. He thought of his brother, of the land that was supposed to offer him peace after the war. Yet here it was, demanding blood before he had even set his pack down. When Emily found her voice, it was hoarser and raw. She spoke of Carver, the man who had taken her family's ranch and left her father with nothing but shame. Sarah's story was no kinder. She told of Carver's men dragging her from her home, marking her as property, daring her to resist. And resist she had, which was why she ended up hanging from that beam outside. Thomas listened in silence, his hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle. He had not come looking for a fight, but the West was never generous with men who only wanted peace. The fire popped, and outside the desert wind carried the faint echo of voices. Carver's name hung in the air like the shadow of a storm. Because when evil owns the land, the question's not whether you will face it, but when. The night after Thomas pulled the two young women from the ropes, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The desert heat had finally given way to a cooler wind, but the weight on his shoulders only grew heavier. He'd come to Prescott Valley for quiet, for a fresh start after too many years of war. Instead, he found himself staring straight at the kind of trouble a man could never walk away from. It was just past midnight when a rider approached. Thomas's hand went to his rifle, but the man raised his empty palm. It was Caleb, one of Carver's men. The same Caleb who had once ridden with Thomas's late brother during the war. His face was worn, lined with regret. "You should have left them, Tom," Caleb muttered. "Carver won't forgive this. He'll bring hell down on you." Thomas studied the man for a long moment, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. Caleb's warning wasn't a threat. It was a plea. He had seen what Carver did to people who stood in his way. And Thomas knew the man was right about one thing. Trouble was coming sooner than anyone wanted. By sunrise, Thomas made his way into town. He walked through the dusty street straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole, an old friend, greeted him with a firm handshake. Cole was a man of the law, but even the law in Prescott had its limits. Carver had money, influence, and men. For years, the sheriff had fought to keep balance, never quite able to tip the scales. Now Thomas had given him something different, living proof of Carver's cruelty. Two young women who could testify. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, looking Thomas in the eye. "If we're going to move against Carver, we'll need more than badges. We'll need people willing to stand up." Carver's shadow stretched far. Folks whispered about the time he strung up 3 men in the town square. Left them to hang while the crowd watched, too scared to intervene. That memory still haunted Prescott, a reminder of what defiance could cost. And that was the truth. The people of Prescott Valley had been afraid for too long. But sometimes all it took was one spark. One man refusing to back down to light a fire in others. Stories like this. Stories of the West where good men and women stand against cruelty. They matter. If you believe these stories should keep living, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined me for the next tale. Because the West has more shadows than you might think, and each story reminds us what courage really looks like. Thomas left the sheriff's office knowing one thing. Carver would not wait, and the fight for this valley would be written in blood. By late afternoon, the valley was no longer quiet. The heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves, and with it came the sound of hooves, dozens of them, pounding like war drums. Carver had come, and he had not come alone. His riders spilled over the ridge, black coats flapping, rifles glinting in the sun. Thomas stood at the cabin, Winchester in hand. Beside him, Sheriff Cole checked his revolver, his jaw tight as stone. Emily and Sarah stayed inside, their eyes wide, but their spirits unbroken. Around them, a few townsfolk had gathered. Men and women who had suffered too long under Carver's grip. They were farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, not soldiers, but people who had finally decided fear would no longer rule their lives. The first shots cracked the heavy summer air. Dust kicked up as bullets tore into the ground near the cabin. Thomas fired back, steady as if he had never left the battlefield. Cole barked orders, his men holding their line, and then the townsfolk joined in. A storekeeper with shaky hands led off a round that dropped one of Carver's riders. A rancher swung his shotgun, the blast echoing across the valley. Carver's men charged, expecting easy victory, but what they found was resistance, fierce and unyielding. The fight turned savage. Horses screamed. Gunham smoke rolled thick and the air burned with powder and sweat. Thomas moved through it all with grim resolve. Every pull of his trigger was a promise kept to the women he had saved, and to the brother who once dreamed this land could be free. But battles are never kind, not even to the brave. A bullet tore into Thomas's side, knocking him to his knees. Blood seeped through his shirt, hot against the desert dust. For a moment, the world narrowed to pain and the weight of the rifle slipping from his hand through the smoke and chaos. Emily rushed to his side. She dropped beside him, her hand gripping his with a strength born of desperation. Her eyes met his, fierce and steady, as if to tell him he could not fall now. And somehow that look pulled him back to his feet. Cole pulled him back, shouting over the roar of gunfire. The townsfolk rallied, pushing Carver's men into retreat. One by one, the tyrant's riders fell or fled until only Carver himself remained, glaring across the field with hatred burning in his eyes. The sun dipped low, the valley glowing red with fire and blood. The battle was not over. It had only shifted, narrowing to one final confrontation between Thomas Grady and Nathaniel Carver. And in that silence before the last storm, one question hung heavy. Would justice stand tall, or would Carver's shadow swallow the valley for good? The valley was quiet at last. Smoke drifted low across the fields, the kind of silence that only comes after chaos. Carver was gone, his men scattered, and Prescott Valley stood free for the first time in years. But freedom never comes cheap. Thomas lay inside the cabin, his shirt torn and bloodied from the gunshot that nearly ended him. Emily knelt at his side, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound, her eyes burning with a mix of fear and something softer. For days, she tended to him, whispering stories, keeping the fire lit, refusing to let the man who saved her drift away. Sarah stayed long enough to see him safe, then chose her own path, leaving to search for what family she had left. It was during those quiet nights, with the desert wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin, that Emily and Thomas found something neither had expected. Out of pain and loss grew trust. Out of survival grew love. Not the wild, hurried love of youth, but the steady, enduring kind that holds fast when storms come. When Thomas finally rose from his bed, weak but alive, he stepped outside with Emily at his side. The same land that once greeted him with cruelty now carried the promise of a second chance. The ropes were gone. In their place, fresh boards and new hands rebuilding. The townsfolk who once lived in fear now walked with pride, knowing they had stood against tyranny and won. Thomas knew the truth his brother had once spoken was right. Land is not just held with paper. It is held with blood, with courage, and with the people willing to protect it. And maybe that is the lesson worth remembering. That even in the darkest moments, one act of courage can spark a fire no tyrant can put out. That family is not always the one you're born into, but the one you build in the ashes of hardship. That love, even late in life, can bloom where despair once stood. Now, I want to ask you, if you were in Thomas's place, would you have cut those ropes knowing the storm it would bring? Was Sheriff Cole right to wait until the people were ready? Or should he have acted long before? And do you believe love born from gratitude can last? Or is it only a fragile flame after the fire? If this story touched you, give it a like. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you will not miss the next tale from the Wild West, because the West still has stories worth telling and together we can keep them live.